Clifton. Um, is the executive director of the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District. Um, and we have a really interesting presentation today for you, and I'm sure Mark can speak more about his expertise, his experience, and kind of the interesting aspects of the presentation that you'll be hearing about today.
Thank you all. This is exciting to be presenting today on kind of where climate change and mosquito resistance to materials and also sustainability kind of all come together into a confluence. And so I'm the executive director of the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District. And with that, I think I'll get started if that's okay.
Absolutely. And if anybody has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And I'm sure Mark will definitely leave some room at the end to answer those questions as well. So uh, feel free to throw those in the chat.
Okay, so is that visible okay?
Good.
Okay. So as I mentioned, my name is Mark Clifton, and I am the Executive Director of the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District. And today I'm going to talk about climate change, resistance, and sustainability, and how a community-wide, publicly funded mosquito control district, like the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District, can and must meet this challenge going forward. This is a shot from the district looking south across Evanston and into the city of Chicago, and kind of gives you an idea of what our district looks like, a mix of urban and suburban communities along Lake Michigan. And so I'm going to divide this talk into just three parts. Part one is the rising threat from vector-borne disease due to climate change. Part two is the resistance, overuse, and regulatory pressure on vector control operations and what this means. And then part three is how we have adapted and continue to adapt to meet this rising threat that we're facing. So I'll start with part one, the rising threat from vector-borne disease. Mosquitoes are really dictated by the first and last frost in a season. Anytime after the last frost and before the first frost, you can have mosquitoes. And since records have been kept in the 1800s, the time of the fall frost has been later, and the spring frost has been earlier. This makes for a longer season, and a longer season makes for more mosquitoes, and also a habitat that can maybe have different kinds of mosquitoes. So the average deviation from our kind of average season length has been increasing, especially since maybe the 1990s. So this means generally more mosquitoes, more types of mosquitoes for longer. And this has definitely been noticed by the WHO and other, in other groups. So this year there's been a variety of articles. The WHO warned that the dengue risk is soaring, and dengue is more of a tropical disease. It's not really a threat here in Chicago, but because of climate change, there's historic highs of dengue. In the middle there, experts say climate change likely to increase U.S. malaria cases. Well, this year we've seen cases in Maryland, Texas, and Florida. And so the United States used to have a lot of malaria and can again. And so this is presumed due to climate change. The warming climate will expand mosquitoes' realm. And then on the bottom left, oh, awesome, mosquitoes are getting more used to Chicago summers. And so as the season gets longer and winters get milder, you have, again, more types of mosquitoes, and they're more abundant. So just as an example of how this works and what we're seeing in our district, this is a projection for how this mosquito, Aedes albopictus, how its distribution should look in 2050. This mosquito was first introduced, it's an invasive mosquito, first introduced in Houston in the 80s, and is widespread throughout the southeastern United States up into the mid-Atlantic states. We do find it in Chicago. In 2050, the probability that it lives in Chicago is basically 100%. It's considered that this will be part of its range, as well as most of Illinois. This mosquito can spread yellow fever, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and it's just a real nuisance. And so it really is a container mosquito. It lives in, different kinds of containers that might be around the home that hold water. And it really likes to bite people. It's a real pain. And so this is what we've seen in the district. The blue line represents the number of locations, trap locations in our district where we've seen Aedes albopictus. And for many decades, we would see occasionally an Aedes albopictus show up, the Asian tiger mosquito. From 2016 through 2020, we just would see it in a few. And then in 2022, we really started to see it. And this last year, we have seen it in every trap in every community throughout the district. It has just exploded in population. And so I'm sure a lot of this has to do with the milder winter we had last year. But considering that this mosquito is expected to live here permanently, we may be seeing it earlier than we thought. It is definitely an example of an invasive mosquito that is a public health risk moving further north than it ever was expected to. And there's a wide variety of mosquitoes that have this capability. This isn't the only one. Not only does the warmer climate change the distribution of mosquitoes, it also changes their ability to transmit disease as there's more thermal energy in the environment. Mosquitoes are cold-blooded. They don't really have blood, but you can call them cold-blooded. Their body temperature is, the external temperature. As they become warmer, their ability to disseminate a viral infection and infect humans goes up. And you can see both Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. These are two of the biggest public health threats in the world for humans. Their ability to transmit viruses has increased. It's not just mosquitoes. Ticks also showing a changing distribution. A perfect example is the black-legged tick, once mostly confined to New England and maybe the very much upper Midwest, maybe the Southeast as well. It is now spread throughout most of the eastern United States. Most counties have this tick. This tick is the vector for Borrelia burgdorferi, which is commonly known as Lyme disease. It's one of the biggest risks in Illinois from tick-borne disease is Lyme disease. The CDC has noticed this trend. In 2018, they put out a vital signs, which reported that the number of cases of disease from mosquitoes, ticks, and flea bites has more than tripled since 2004. They reported more than 640,000 cases of diseases between 2004 and 2016, and 9 new germs spread by mosquitoes and ticks have been discovered since 2004. And so they report in bold, this is their words, that mosquito-borne disease epidemics are happening more frequently. Illinois is certainly not immune from this situation. The CDC reports that Illinois is in the top quintile for mosquito-borne disease. That's the top 20%. Our biggest risk here is West Nile virus. Cook County frequently, not every year, but frequently is among the top 5 counties in the United States for human cases of West Nile virus. And secondarily is Lyme disease. There's an awful lot of Lyme disease as well. So we happen to be one of the states more at risk for mosquito-borne disease. And this is not, this is not a good situation. Not every state deals with this. So if you look across the United States at the ability to control mosquitoes, it's severely lagging, actually. There's not a lot of resources put into it. The National Association of City and County Health Officials in 2017 looked at the capacity to control mosquitoes in the United States. And they found that about half of the vector control programs are run by local health departments, but only 3% of them are considered fully capable. And they have a series of criteria that they use to rank programs and whether they're fully capable. Only 26% of actual mosquito controlled districts were rated as fully capable, or even another 8% competent. 65% need improvement. So there's a tremendous gap between the need for vector control and the ability to actually do it. And who ends up paying the price is public health. So their recommendation, NATRO's recommendations, were to form mosquito control districts that can perform all of the core competencies, and also ensure sustainable funding and resources are dedicated to local vector control to properly maintain the staff and supplies to perform all the different abatement activities that might be necessary to protect public health from this rising threat of viruses and bacteria, vector-borne diseases. So not surprisingly, the CDC rates Illinois as vulnerable to vector-borne disease. Less than 20% of the programs in the state are ranked as fully capable or competent. The CDC considers the state to be vulnerable, and climate change and globalization are driving these new patterns of disease transmission and introductions of new pathogens and vectors. And so Illinois will continue to stay vulnerable. So I'm going to move on to part two. Against this backdrop of a rising tide of vector-borne disease, we have real-world issues that are impeding the ability to do anything about it. And so to kind of understand how this works, I'm just going to go back to the basics about the mosquito life cycle. I think this is kind of critical to understanding where our shortcomings lie. And so mosquitoes are a lot like maybe butterflies in that they are, nobody believes me, but they're completely, they metamorphosize completely. So that means that they go through a larval and a pupal stage, and then they metamorphosize into an adult, just like a butterfly would go through a caterpillar and a cocoon and metamorphosize into a butterfly. So a female adult mosquito will feed on blood, lay eggs. Those eggs will turn to larvae. Those larvae will develop into pupa or pupae, and those pupae will eventually emerge again into adult mosquitoes. It doesn't take many eggs or many mosquitoes to quickly produce a tremendous amount of adult mosquitoes, adult biting mosquitoes. So this picture is from one source of mosquitoes that we found in the district, and it contains about 65 egg rafts, and every one of those egg rafts contains between 1 and 300 mosquito eggs. So right there in that picture, that pool, that little batch of eggs or egg rafts will produce between 6,000 and 20,000 mosquitoes within the next 7 days. So it doesn't take much water to produce a tremendous amount of mosquitoes. When you look at the infection rates from West Nile virus that we get in this district, out of maybe 20,000 mosquitoes, thousands of those will become infected with West Nile virus. So that one kiddie pool will generate thousands of infected mosquitoes during August or maybe early September of any given year. So even that is really a public health risk for the people that might live around that kiddie pool. There's really limited ways to reduce mosquitoes. You can either kill larval mosquitoes or you can kill adult mosquitoes. So to kill larval mosquitoes, you have to know where they are. They're only in water, so you have to know where the water is, and then you have to put something targeted to just the location where those larvae are. To kill adult mosquitoes, you have to distribute something over a wide area. So that's typically called spraying for mosquitoes. It's also done commercially as what's called a barrier treatment, where some material is applied to foliage. Usually this is a commercial application. This is not a method of public health mosquito control that would be done by a governmental entity like us. But they'll, a barrier or a residual product is applied to foliage around individual properties. So it's kind of a piecemeal approach. Those are really the only ways of targeting mosquitoes to reduce their numbers. And so for us, when the larvae are all together in one little spot, that's way more effective than waiting until they become adults and they're all flying around and you have to drive through neighborhoods spraying for them. We don't really want to do that. We want to target them when they're in a specific location before they become adults. So I wanted to compare some of the differences between larvicides and adulticides, these two different ways that you can reduce the population of mosquitoes. So larvicides are typically very specific for mosquitoes. They're pretty much based on biological or biorational pesticides. So that could be bacteria or a mosquito hormone. They targeted to only the locations where larval mosquitoes reside. This might be a stormwater catch basin, or maybe a pool that hasn't been maintained, or whatever location where larval mosquitoes are living. It's very time sensitive. You only have a few days to target them before they turn into adults and fly away. And this is best done by a public community-wide program, such as a mosquito abatement district, because you have to access many places that are public. You have to access maybe residences. You have to be able to go to public rights of way, and you have to go to places where mosquitoes are being produced that may not be owned by anyone, or may be owned by a city or a park district or a forest preserve district or whatever. And so the idea here with a larvicide is to prevent them from ever flying and ever biting and ever laying eggs. An adulticide tends to be broad spectrum. They can affect any insect. These typically, are not biological. They're a chemical adulticide. They're usually based on pyrethrum, which was originally from chrysanthemums, but has been modified to have different characteristics. They can have a short or a long residual effect. There's dozens of different pyrethroids. They can be applied in a wide area, or they can be applied as a barrier around a home and places where mosquitoes might rest. And they can be done by a public entity, like a district, but they're most commonly done by a commercial program. Like a resident might sign a contract with a mosquito killer LLC or whatever, and they would come do a barrier treatment. Now, for us, the central guiding principle for how we control mosquitoes is integrated pest management. And this is a holistic community-wide approach where we work at the bottom of the pyramid to prevent mosquitoes. We try to teach people how to prevent mosquitoes. We use physical methods like actually removing habitat, removing tires and other things from the environment, maybe moving up the pyramid to biological methods of control, before ultimately, if necessary, using a chemical method of control. And that would be, typically in an emergency situation. For us, if we do the bottom levels of the pyramid correctly, we never need to get to the top of the pyramid. And we haven't in the last 5 years had to do any sort of broad spectrum adult control for mosquitoes. But it requires a lot of work at the bottom of this pyramid. And so the IPM approach really works. This is common in agriculture and lots of different pest management applications. And this is how we operate as a district. I wanted to just touch briefly on West Nile and why sometimes you need to control adult mosquitoes if you have lost control of the larval population, which can happen due to temperature, rainfall patterns, or different climate conditions. So West Nile is a bird virus that is maintained between birds and mosquitoes most of the time, mostly Culex mosquitoes. In this area, we have 2 different species of Culex mosquitoes that can vector this disease. When the amount of virus becomes really high, that virus, we call it spilling over into human populations. Occasionally, a Culex mosquito will bite a human. It's not really their preferred source of blood, but they will. And so when the infection rate of mosquitoes becomes high, you will start seeing human cases. Right now in Illinois, there are 18 human cases and 1 death. This is mostly in Cook County. And we'll probably end the year at 2 or 3 times that amount as these cases trickle out. So the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District measures mosquitoes for virus every day during the season. And this is a graph that shows what we're measuring. We create what's called a vector index, which is an estimation of the risk from mosquitoes based on how infected they are. Typically, a vector index above 1 means that there will be humans that become infected. And this happens just about every year. In yellow, you'll see our average vector index. That's a 9-year average that just about crests at 1 and then comes back down. So we're right now in kind of the tail end of the West Nile season. The red line is from 2020. That's our vector index that shot up to about 3. I think we had 4 or 5 human cases in the district in 2020. What we're really concerned about is a 2012 year. That's that blue triangle in the middle. sometimes climate conditions can create an absolute bumper crop of mosquitoes, and that raises the vector index up to absurd levels like 8 or so. Um, in this situation, there was hundreds of people in Illinois who got ill, and probably dozens within the district who got ill from West Nile. And those are the conditions where we would initiate like an emergency adult mosquito control when we know humans are going to become sick from West Nile. So I wanted to contrast what ULV is, what we would use with a truck versus like what a barrier treatment is, because I'm not sure that people fully understand how these are different. And this is actually really important for the resistance story that I'm going to tell next. So ULV adulticiding is a community-wide intervention. This is done in the public right-of-way for the entire community. It's an emergency response to a defined public health threat that we've measured for many years, and we know exactly at what point humans will become ill. So this is an emergency response. It has a very short residual, typically a half-life of a few hours, which limits effects to non-targets. It's always done at night. It's applied to the air column as a fog or a mist, and it is intended to target flying mosquitoes. It's not intended to deposit on surfaces. It's only done as part of an overall integrated pest management plan where you've already done all the preventative work, you've done the larval control, you've removed the tires, you've done all the things that are non-chemical first, or even non-biological, prevention first, to try and control that public health risk. And only when that has all failed would you use something like this. It's pyrethroid based. A barrier treatment is typically an individual intervention for a specific property. It's by contract, or maybe a resident has done this on their own. There's products that are available for sale to do these. They're typically a response to nuisance mosquitoes, just being bit by mosquitoes, which is not the same as a public health risk. So there's no defined, in the literature, there's no defined public health benefit from a barrier treatment. There's no evidence that shows that they change the risk of humans getting ill or not from something like West Nile virus. They're typically applied monthly by subscription. So there's usually not a lot of evidence to justify the use of it that's generated. They're applied to foliage where mosquitoes may rest, which would raise the risk to non-target organisms. They have a long residual, typically 3 or 4 weeks, also increases the risk of impacts to non-target organisms. Generally, they occur outside of an integrated pest management framework. None of the prevention activity, the community-wide activity, has been done ahead of time. It's just done, on a schedule. These are also pyrethroid based, and they're very popular in our region. Many people opt for the barrier treatment approach. So this generates a problem for us. We have a defined public health mission. We have one tool available in an emergency situation to try and protect public health. But because pyrethroids are used so commonly in the environment, our mosquitoes are resistant to pyrethroids, mostly resistant. We haven't had to do any we haven't used pyrethroids in 5 years, but we still see very high levels of resistance. We measure this by putting mosquitoes in bottles with a small amount of whatever material we're interested in. In this case, it was sumethrin and permethrin. These are both pyrethroids. And we see where mortality should be 100%. I mean, the mosquitoes are in a bottle with it. We only see 60% mortality in the case of permethrin, and 74% in the case of sumethrin. So that is strongly suggestive of resistance. And in fact, across the state of Illinois, this is the norm rather than the rarity. Permethrin and malathion, both mosquitoes are resistant to both permethrin and malathion from the southern end of the state all the way up through the Chicagoland area. So this is a common emerging story really throughout the United States. We've relied on this for a long time, and mosquitoes have grown resistant. And so we asked in 2022, where is this resistance coming from? And I kind of alluded to where we think it's coming from. But we had catch basin water. So throughout every neighborhood in the district, there's catch basins that hold hundreds of gallons of water. Even when it's dry like it is now, they'll hold hundreds of gallons of water. They're the perfect habitat for mosquitoes, and every house has one in front of it. We sampled 107 of these, and 27 contained detectable concentrations of 5 different pyrethroids. None of these are materials that are used by the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District or have ever been used by us. The highest concentrations were 4 to 5 parts per billion, which is high enough to make resistant mosquitoes. So we detected beta-cyfluthrin, bifenthrin, cypermethrin, lambda, cyhalothrin, and permethrin. Those are all typically used as barrier treatments. So the ubiquity of pyrethroids is driving resistance, and it's impacting our ability to respond in an emergency. It's also important to note that barrier applications are made to foliage. And this is a picture I just pulled offline when I looked up barrier treatment mosquito. And here's someone kind of, spraying the vegetation, the landscaping around a home, which is typically flowers, because people like to plant flowers and bees like to visit flowers. So kind of an attractive hazard. And most of these products are toxic to bees if they're exposed. They're not supposed to apply them to crops or weeds or any place where bees are going to be visiting. And so throughout the North Shore, we have, and really the state of Illinois, we have a specific rusty patch bumblebee. This is an endangered native pollinator. There's zones that the Fish and Wildlife Service have drawn where they consider this bee to be a high potential to still exist. This is throughout Wilmette, this one. And these are all suburban neighborhoods where people might be doing these barrier treatments, and these bees might be visiting their flowers. So not only is it impacting our ability to do our public health mission, but it really impacts non-targets and endangered species, especially native pollinators, potentially. So to sum up this part of the talk, that resistance really reduces the utility of a critical public health tool. It takes away the top of our pyramid. And so we've had to invest strongly in all of the other layers of the pyramid. But, with a variable changing climate, you never know what any year could bring. And so we do like to have the ability to respond effectively if necessary. We also see resistance to larval control materials. And so I'm not going to get into too much of what this figure is showing, but the black line is showing us how a susceptible mosquito should respond to a product like methoprin. And methoprin is a mosquito hormone. It's not directly toxic. It's non-toxic to humans and any sort of mammal or anything like that. This is applied to catch basins typically to control mosquitoes that might be living there. And we find that the red line is what our Culex pipiens mosquitoes look like. And so they're about 500 times more resistant than susceptible colony Culex pipiens. Methoprin is a material that's been used by mosquito abatement for many, many decades without rotation and without consideration that resistance can develop. So we see a rising threat of resistance to lots of different things, and some of the safest, most specific materials like methoprin. This is true for all insecticides. This figure is showing us in red the number of compounds where at least one insect is resistant has dramatically increased since the 1960s. This figure is still 15 years old. And then in blue, the number of species where they're resistant to at least one compound. And so both of these have risen dramatically. At the same time that this has happened, regulatory pressure has made the new active ingredient registrations drop off dramatically since maybe the 60s or 70s. So there's nothing new that's going to come that's going to solve this. There's just less materials available, and they're becoming resistant to the materials that are out there. And this is true for agriculture, for mosquito control, all throughout. So everything we've become used to in terms of being able to control pests of crops or human health pests is slowly changing. Okay, so I wanted to talk lastly about our district and how we've had to adjust to this reality to meet this threat, both now and in the future, in a way that's sustainable, meaning we're not going to develop resistance, we're not going to affect non-targets, we're not just, we want to develop a program that 50 years from now will still work with no new things coming on the market. Um, so it's clear that mosquitoes can come from lots of places. They can come from the ditch on the swale on the side of the road, or maybe a flooded area next to a river. That's very common for us. Sometimes yards have depressions where maybe somebody buried something and it all collapsed a long time ago, and that holds water. Or even just a flooded field. In the top right, there's a picture of a flooded field with like a long dark line that kind of looks like a snake. That is all mosquito pupae, millions and millions of them, all waiting to emerge, all kind of balled up. So that's typically what we would see, something like that. So what do you do when the source of mosquitoes isn't yours? Maybe your neighbor has a pool that's just unattended and has growing mosquitoes. Every home has a stormwater catch basin in front of it that they all hold water. Maybe it's a flooded field or park after a huge rainstorm down the street. So what do you do when you have that situation? I mean, one option is to put a barrier around your property with an adulticide. The other option is to have a mosquito abatement district that can deal with these things in a holistic way for the benefit of everyone. And so the North Shore Mosquito Abatement District was established in 1927 specifically to deal with this exact issue. This has been an issue in this area since the 20s, since Chicago developed. We cover 70 square miles and 14 communities. About 330,000 people live within the district. We treat over 60,000 stormwater catch basins for larval mosquitoes. The water drainage system in this region is by far the biggest source of public health threat mosquitoes that we face. And so every one of these catch basins is treated to reduce the amount of Culex mosquitoes that emerge. We have another 3,000 off-road sites that we monitor and treat as necessary. Our budget, we do this all for about 1.84 million, so less than $6 per resident for this public health function. 7 full-time employees and between 15 and 20 seasonals that we hire every spring to help us do this. We follow, as I mentioned, an integrated pest management approach where most of our activities are dedicated to the bottom of this pyramid, preventing mosquitoes, educating the public about how to prevent mosquitoes, physically changing the environment to make it difficult for mosquitoes. For us, that typically means removing tires. Biological materials are big for us. That's a lot of our larvicides are biological. And then finally, we have the ability to intervene, at the top of the pyramid. So the most commonly used materials are Bacillus sphaericus, which is a bacteria, BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis, that's a BT that's specific for mosquitoes. Both of those are completely non-toxic to pets, humans, pollinators, non-targets. They're extremely specific for just mosquitoes. We have the ability to use like mineral oil. Those sometimes you find a source where the larvae have turned into pupae, and pupae don't feed, so they're not going to eat any of the bacteria you might add. And so you need a mineral oil to suffocate them, maybe in a catch basin, so that will form a film and make it difficult for the mosquito to stay at the surface and utilize the surface tension of the water to stay there to breathe. And then in a lot of catch basins, we also use a mosquito hormone called pyriproxyfen. And so that will give us like long-lasting control and prevent those Culex mosquitoes from emerging. We combine all of these materials, these biological and biorational materials, with extremely detailed GIS maps. And this is really the thing that I think makes this program unique. This map is every larval habitat that we know of. Someone has gone out and walked the perimeter and entered it into one of our maps, and we inspect these every 7 days and look for mosquito larvae. Often they're dry, sometimes they just have water, sometimes they have water and larvae and they need a treatment. And then sometimes after the treatment, when we find larvae, we'll do the treatment. And we have a whole color scheme that tells us what's going on with the different habitats that exist. So we have thousands of these mapped. And this is great because it prevents us from having to do any sort of wide area application of a material. We can go to the source of mosquitoes when they're in a puddle somewhere and deal with them in a biological material rather than have to use a pyrethroid or something else. This is a close-up of maybe some floodwater sites along the Skokie River. Again, these are really just puddles that we have individually mapped. For these kinds of areas, we'll often use this truck, and this truck distributes basically a mixture of water and bacteria. And when the wind is right, we can distribute this bacteria into the water, and it kills just mosquitoes. And so we do a lot of this wide area larviciding in these areas along rivers that might flood in the spring. A major part of our program is stormwater catch basins in many of our communities. These basins are in people's backyards, they're between homes, they're in front of people's homes, they're everywhere. And most of them look like something in the top right there. They have leaf litter and yard debris, and they just are really organically rich and produce a lot of mosquitoes. And they'll sit there with hundreds of gallons of water um, all summer long producing mosquitoes. And so we have maps of every catch basin in the district. These are always being updated and audited, and we'll send an employee to check each one of these and to treat. And so this is a major part of what we do to reduce that public health risk. We also have a variety of homes and yards in our maps. So these can be like these depressions or flooded areas between homes, or there's just a variety of things you'd be surprised that people that tolerate in their yards. It could be pools. So we have a whole thousands of different yards where people have asked us to come and inspect and kind of maintain the mosquito population in their yard using larvicides. And so we'll do that. We also accept service requests from the public. We count on the public to tell us if there's a mosquito problem, or if there's something down the road, or maybe their neighbor that we should come and deal with. And only a public entity can do this for the community. And so our website has a service request feature. It also has a feature where people can see all of our real-time treatment activity. If they want to know what we are doing in front of their house, they can look on that real-time treatment activity map, and they can see exactly what we applied, when we were there, what we found when we inspected, whatever it may be. All of these maps are reflected back out to the public so that they can see our activities. People can make a service request to do lots of things, and none of these are chemical interventions. These are all source reduction type activities. They can tell us about biting mosquitoes. They can have their property evaluated for mosquito production. They can tell us about a catch basin, containers, fountains, ponds that are producing mosquitoes, standing water. We pick up waste tires that are holding water. Maybe there's an abandoned pool. Any of these sorts of small sources that harass people, we can take care of, usually by eliminating the source of the water and eliminating the problem so it never comes back. So I would argue only a community-wide program that controls the source of mosquitoes using biological and biorational larvicides is sustainable. I don't think any of the other approaches, waiting until they're adults and then doing a bunch of spraying, is a sustainable approach. It has a lot of unintended consequences, and it just, there's resistance. It doesn't seem to work. So we've been really effective merging biological larvicides with GIS technology. All of our staff are out in the field with tablets monitoring all of these sources. And so we've seen our incidence, our share of West Nile virus in the state of Illinois has been declining since the 2000s. And after 2016 is when we implemented this GIS biological approach. And it's been really effective. We've continued to reduce our share of the cases that occur in Illinois. And then our nuisance mosquitoes, so these are just mosquitoes that are annoying, that people complain about. We haven't had big peaks of mosquitoes since we started using that buffalo turbine and wide area larviciding with BTI. That's been really effective in eliminating just huge broods of mosquitoes that ruin your backyard. We're always going to have mosquitoes, and that's part of the deal, is that our public is going to have to learn to live with some mosquitoes, but we can at least make the outdoors tolerable and reduce the reliance on barrier treatments. That's really our goal, is for people to not need to hire contractors to do this work. We're doing it and doing it effectively since 2019. And so we accomplish all of these things in this little tiny building here with the solar panels. This is where we work. We're right on the corner of I don't know, Northfield Road and Winnetka Road. So if anybody would ever like a tour, feel free to reach out sometime. I'd be happy to give a group a tour, and you can see exactly with more detail how we accomplish this mission. But I'd also be happy to answer any questions. So I'll stop sharing now, and maybe we can move to questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great, Mark. Thank you so much. That was extremely informative. And I love the intersection of, informing about how climate change will impact mosquito populations, the public, the importance of getting the public involved and getting them informed about all the precautions that can be made and the services that uh, the district provides. It's massively helpful, and I understand that when you want to control something, especially in the context of public health, you want to make sure you're having preventative measures as opposed to addressing the problem like as it pops up, right?
Right. That's the key, proactive and preventative.
Yeah, and so we do have some questions in the chat that I think you'd be great to answer.
Sure.
So Susan is asking, does the city of Chicago have an active mosquito abatement district? And if not, like, what do you think the reason why they don't?
They
Or
don't.
yeah,
They have, they are managed by the city itself. So it's part of city government. And so that is a model that a lot of cities use. Miami is one, Dallas, a lot of big cities use that model. It has some flaws because budgets tend to fluctuate dramatically as budgetary conditions change. A district like us, we're a special use district, kind of like a fire district or school district. We collect our own tax revenue. So we ensure stable funding from year to year because you never know what year you're going to have a serious problem. And so I think Chicago does have a mosquito control program focused on public health, but it's not a district, and its effectiveness in any given year depends a lot on the money that they get. So,
great. And Lauren is asking, based on these proven threats to public health measures as well as ecological damage to non-targets that the increased resistance to permethrin is causing, can we work to ban the commercial adult mosquito control in the state? And if there's any draft or proposed legislation focused on that, or if that's ever existed or exists now.
yes, a couple of years ago, we worked with Representative Gable to create legislation. It was HB 3118. It was a so-called pollinator bill or bee bill. And it would have required at least evidence of mosquitoes prior to a barrier being conducted. It would have banned the subscription model where treatment is done on a subscription. And that, faced some pressure from different groups in the state and was somewhat changed. There's some great parts of that bill. It required a whole different level of training for people who are doing these mosquito barrier treatments. It required signage to go in yards. If someone has done one of these, like if you have a turf grass treatment, typically there's signage that's required to go in that yard. And this bill required that for the mosquito barriers as well. It also defined what a mosquito barrier treatment is in the law for the first time. So while it didn't eliminate the subscription-based model, it did offer a lot of positive things, but certainly there's probably more that can be done. There are valid uses for a barrier treatment, but they really need to fit into an integrated, holistic framework. And so I do get, there are people who that might be the only option, but it's not a great blanket solution for everyone at all times. So any sort of and this is just my opinion, there has to be there's a needle that has to be threaded to target the problem without making without affecting people's ability to just use the public area or their yard or whatever. So
Absolutely, and that can definitely, you know, as you mentioned, right, towing the line, threading the needle, right, having these, uh, holistic
Yeah.
policy, interventions, right? We want to make sure that if there is something that's introduced, it's actually going to resolve the issue at hand, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then we're working on our end to do a good job of controlling mosquitoes in the public sphere so that people don't feel the need to hire. They just don't need it. So that's kind of how we're approaching the problem.
And then Meredith is asking about how folks can help with mosquito prevention when removing water is not an option. So, for example, intentional flood control spaces like rain gardens and bioswales.
So typically, those are supposed to be designed to not hold water long enough to produce mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are very specific about the water that they will lay eggs in. They respond to microbial cues in the water. And so they know if it's going to be a good habitat, if it has the right microbial environment for their offspring. Because remember, larval mosquitoes are micropredators. They're feeding on bacteria and all kinds of other things. And so typically rain gardens and bioswales, if they're designed correctly, will drain after, a few days at the most. But if their water is standing for 5 or more days, then there's a risk that that becomes a larval habitat. And so, in that case, the only solution is to apply one of the larvicides regularly. There is really no other solution. Or just if you can't drain it, then there has to be treatment. And there's a lot of places in the district that are like that they have to be treated because there's no other solution. And part of it's just developing urban spaces. We develop it for a lot of human needs, but we didn't think about mosquitoes when we did it. Like when we designed the stormwater infrastructure, no one thought about mosquitoes. We just thought about getting rid of the flooding. And so, um, that's kind of an unintended consequence that falls to the mosquito abatement district. Oh, okay. We lost Sergio. Well, I can move on, Sergio, to the next one myself, I guess. Is that all right? Okay, so the next question was from Carrie was, I joined late, but wondered if bats were mentioned as a potential treatment method. So bats are not a great prevention method. They can feed on mosquitoes. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But mosquitoes are kind of like cicadas in that they come in giant broods and overwhelm predators often. And so it's good to have bats because they're important for a lot of functions in the ecosystem. Um, but they are not going to prevent all the mosquitoes. But of course, every little bit helps. So it's important to have them for a lot of different reasons. Okay, so thank you, Margaret, for that compliment. That is awesome. I love hearing that. Um, okay, Walt asked, 2012 was a drought year, and so why was West Nile so bad that year? No one really knows exactly what climate conditions create a bad West Nile year, but a drought is one of the conditions that seems to. Some people suspect that it brings birds and mosquitoes in near proximity to the same water sources. It's likely, it also is related to temperature. Warmer temperatures can drive viral replication and drive higher infection rates. But climate and how climate affects West Nile is one of the big unanswered questions. And actually, West Nile was kind of we saw really high infection rates this year, and this was a drought year as well. It wasn't as bad as 2012, but it wasn't great either. Okay, so Geraldine, let's see. Yeah, I've heard the truck, the story a lot from Geraldine that people would follow mosquito abatement trucks while they spewed DDT. Yeah, DDT was commonly used starting in the 1940s. This district here also used it up until 1971. And that is probably the root cause of a lot of resistance that we see now. Um, Fortunately, it's been phased out completely, and we have different ways of doing this. For Lauren Marquez, Viso, you say you're in Evanston and you have a stormwater basin. You should definitely go to our website at nsmad.org and enter a treatment request. And there's an option for storm drain, and we will put that on our map and make sure it's treated every year from now on. If you see the ones treated nearby, those maps are highly specific. So if you see ones treated nearby, that doesn't mean that one in your yard has been treated. You should still enter the service request and tell them that there might be one in your yard or on your property, because they might not know about it, and we will add it to our maps. From Linda, I'm glad you can hear me. I wasn't sure. So for Linda, I clean my bird bath every other day. Our bird bath's a big source of mosquitoes. My neighbor never cleans his. Yeah, if it's not being cleaned, they will produce mosquitoes. Absolutely. They need to be dumped out or every few days and refilled with water. If they're not, then they're a source of mosquitoes. And if you live in the district, that's something you can tell us about, and we will definitely deal with that. So. Okay, I think that's all of the questions. I'm not sure if Sergio's still here. I think he might have had to drop off. So unless there's any other questions, I wanted to thank everyone for attending and listening to what we do. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. It's kind of an esoteric little corner of what makes modern life function. And we're really unknown to a large degree. And every part of Cook County has this and most of the state actually has some sort of mosquito control apparatus running in the background, either through a health department or a district. And so it is part of life, and will continue to be so. And I just thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, our internet went down in our office, so uh, that's been unfortunate, but I'm sure you gave some great responses to the questions that were posed, and just want to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to share your presentation and share your expertise as well on the subject.
No problem. Thank you.
Right. And thanks to everyone who attended. This presentation was recorded and will be posted on our IEC YouTube page, as well as our website. So you can be on the lookout for that, and we'll make sure to send an email as well. Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.